Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the mornings. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, March 2nd, 2021. I had to kind of slow down there. All of a sudden, I was like, forgot the year. Want to make sure I got it right on this. Okay. Hey, how come Al Franken is trending? Do we know? I don't. Oh, okay. I see. I clicked on it now, and I guess Al Franken is trending because Governor Cuomo, but Governor Cuomo is a story that I haven't paid enough attention to, and so I don't know. I guess I'll continue the tradition. Cuomo just has never been a terribly interesting figure to me, but I guess now he's wrapped up in something that's going to demand some attention. Cuomo accused of unwanted advance at a wedding, which is a terrible time. Don't wait until your wedding to make an advance and find out whether it's wanted or not. Of course, it's not his own wedding. And maybe that's the problem. Here, let's see. Cuomo accused of unwanted advance at a wedding. Can I kiss you? All right. I mean, I guess that's not the worst advance I've ever heard, but I guess if you're married to someone else, okay. And it's not the only one. The young woman's account follows two separate accusations that Governor Andrew Cuomo sexually harassed two female state employees. And, well, that's one of the things you're not supposed to do as anyone, but particularly as governor. And so, bad news. I've never been a huge Andrew Cuomo fan. I thought there were some things he did admirably during the pandemic and some things he did a really crappy job on during the pandemic. And then, he was also as governor before the pandemic. And there weren't a lot of fans of Andrew Cuomo among the ranks of the listenership of the show. My own Twitter cadre, I guess. Never been huge Cuomo fans. And, okay. Well, we'll watch that one play out. I'm not a New York voter, but I think New York voters will probably take care of this one pretty well. And I guess everyone comparing it to Al Franken now saying that once again, with these accusations hanging out there that against the Democrat, that the Democrat should do the honorable thing and resign. Republicans, of course, Democrats also call for Republicans to do the honorable thing and resign. They just never do it. And part of that is because Republicans also don't ask their people under accusation to resign. Continuing problem. So we'll continue to monitor that, but I guess that's the answer as to what that name is doing trending at the moment. And, well, that wasn't terribly exciting or anything, but okay. At least we're up to speed on that one. It is Tuesday, as I mentioned earlier, and we'll be expecting to hear from Joan McCarter in the second half of today's program, right around the last half-hour segment or so. But for now, the Kagro in the Morning radio show with me, Kagro X. This is how Bill is explaining the whole thing to those of you. Me, Kagro X, David Waldman. It's live now, thanks to a little-known parliamentary procedure that only requires one vote. The neighbor's dog, Sparky. That's right, as long as Sparky keeps it down. The neighbor's dog, one of the neighbor's dogs is named Athena. She's a pretty quiet dog. She doesn't have much to say. There's a small yappy dog whose name I forget that lives next door. Noisy, but won't come through on the microphone, I don't think. And nothing's disturbing her at the moment. And we should be fine. It'll only when I enter or leave my house during periods in which the neighbor dog has decided to take up residence in the window of her house. And I'm not allowed to, walk nearby her house. You know how it goes with dogs when she's in the window. And then you'll hear her. And we'll mic that for you one day. All right. Let's see. Oh, I'm getting my notice that it's time to prepare myself for the annual, except for last year, March basketball tournament, which means torturing myself at some point on or near the Ides, I guess, of March. with a 2-day bonanza of tearing my hair out over whether or not I should play in one of these pools and whether to pick one team I know nothing about or the other team I know nothing about, and basing my entire life on that. So I'm looking forward to that once again. I was really relieved, actually, to see the tournament canceled last year and not to have to fill out one of those brackets. It's very stressful for some reason. And but a reason that I never conclude is good enough to not do that the next year. I think I did that once, and I was miserable, like not having anything to do during this national event, and no interest in any of the games. So it creates some interest, and I guess I'll give in to it one more time. Okay, let's see. Other stories we have to touch on today in order to prepare not only for real life in the new under the new presidency and for getting things done, but also just really basically for being caught up to talk to Joan when she comes by. Lots happening on the Hill today as everybody gets back to work. The House begins work in earnest on their big priority. You'll remember that we've mentioned on the show before that when they reserve a bill number, a very low bill number, like especially H.R. 1 in the House that's usually designated for their top priority. And in this case, it is they're calling it the For the People Act. This is a lot of an amalgam of voting access legislation, and it is being combined with the George Floyd Policing Act, which will hopefully bring some reforms anyway to American local police forces, perhaps begin limiting, sending them nuclear weapons and such, things like this, that caught Armando by surprise way back in the olden days of 2012 I remember this was the first time it really struck him so clearly. 2012, as we were at the Democratic National Convention in Charlotte, and he saw police being dispatched to what? I don't even remember. I mean, there was no riot going on. It was just a probably, small to medium-sized protest happening somewhere. And they dispatched, quite militarized police force. And Armando was like, what the hell are we doing with this anyway, exactly? And people have been pointing that out ever since. And send from before as well, of course. But it was I don't know, it just strikes me that it took him by surprise that time. Anyway, H.R. 1, the For the People Act, first up in the House this week, just by way of informing you what they're looking at and how long this thing should take them to get wrapped up. There are 56 amendments in order under the rule. So this could pretty much take all day. First votes predicted anywhere from just after the show ends to, I guess it's 11:30 to 1:45 that they're predicting the first votes. I told you the House can be a lot more precise about these things. Over in the Senate, I don't know. They'll be working on the COVID relief bill at some point this week. I believe they've got a nomination on the floor for Secretary of Commerce. And, they just let things fall where they may over in the Senate. They could never predict anything as precisely as they do in the House. 11:30 to 1:45 is about when the first votes are predicted. Last votes predicted somewhere between 6 and 7:30 p.m. I don't know that they're getting all the way through this bill and all 56 amendments today. They may carry that over until tomorrow. They'll just wrap up the voting around 7:30 or so and push things over into tomorrow. The rule for consideration of H.R. 1 also includes the rule, I believe they did a combined rule for the People Act and the George Floyd Policing Act. More about that one perhaps later on. And I know that Joan will likely want to, well, depending on if we get steered off in another direction, talk about what's going on in the Supreme Court with a case looming that could further erode protections for voters in this country and further undo the Voting Rights Act. We'll see whether the court There's no reason to believe that they haven't moved even further in this direction, though it may or may not trouble the Chief Justice at some point. I don't know. It may be that he was put on the court for this purpose of unraveling the Voting Rights Act, and the last portions standing, I guess, come under test at some point this week. We'll have to catch up on. Joan's been writing about it. She'll know the answers offhand. In the meantime, we can take a brief survey of the landscape. You know what? As a matter of fact, this is as good a time as any to fit more segments of liberal thinking, liberal thinking's 6-part series on what is, at this point, because the House has already passed the COVID relief bill and the Senate getting ready to act on it on the floor, something of a wish list of items that I suppose a strong progressive, as he describes himself, like Rich, would wish to see in this bill, true, but probably in future bills as well. At the minimum, it serves as an interesting laundry list for pushing out an Overton window on these things. I think at this point, at this stage of the legislative game, we're pretty well beyond the point where we would be able to see these things added to this bill by amendment or any other mechanism at this point. But this is a great opportunity to run down a number of interesting interpretations of progressive priorities and think about what we might need to do to organize to see any form of them realized in future bills. But I'm glad we've got this. There are, as I mentioned, 6 segments. We ran through segment 1 and 2 yesterday. Let's get 3 and 4 done here, and we can do it while the tea is still hot. How about that? Rich, do you mind? Take it away.
Hello, this is Rich, also known as Liberal Thinking. I represent a strong progressive view within the Democratic Party. Previously, I suggested progressives support the American Rescue Plan, now pending in Congress, but with changes to better respond to the coronavirus and its economic aftermath. But in addition to the rescue plan, our party wants to increase the minimum wage over the next 4 years to $15 an hour, since the only way to pass a robust rescue plan is with a rule that avoids the filibuster. Both the American Rescue Plan and the minimum wage increase are moving forward under reconciliation. However, some members of Congress are balking at $15 an hour, suggesting it is too much for their poor area of the country. For example, Senator Manchin of West Virginia wants a target closer to $11 per hour. Yet, a living wage in Charleston, West Virginia is closer to $27 an hour. That's what it costs a single parent with a child to make ends meet. That's why many people are calling for a target of $25 an hour. A person like Joe Manchin, who won't support that, must not like children. Reconciliation should be used for more than just raising the minimum wage and pressing forward with the American Rescue Plan. Remember, reconciliation was used to pass the Trump tax cuts. Democrats should repeal those tax cuts in the same reconciliation bill. This tax cut was almost completely designed to help the rich. The provisions helping anyone else phase out after a few years, but the cuts for the very, very wealthy and major corporations will keep giving to them until we fix the problem. On top of that, the CARES Act from last spring just larded on more money for the wealthy. By itself, it is estimated to have donated nearly $1 trillion just to billionaires. This isn't small change. The cumulative deficit for the Trump years was around $3.5 trillion, adding over $4 trillion to our national debt. This is without the additional cost of COVID. So just the Republican part of the debt increase means the average American owes around $13,000 more than before. Very few Americans got more than that back in their income tax cuts, if anything at all. And each year, the Trump tax cuts add about another $1 trillion of deficit. Please join me in urging your representatives in Congress to make changes to this legislation so it will better serve the country. Challenge them to consider a $25 an hour minimum wage. Demand they repeal the Trump tax cuts. Urge them to make benefit payments monthly rather than making a one-time payment. Ask them to put the money earmarked for children into programs designed to help those hurt by the pandemic, or at least mark it for long-term programs like funding for pre-kindergarten schooling. You can find Enhancing the American Rescue Plan, along with other posts by Liberal Thinking, in the All Daily Coast Progressives group. Join our group and make your own contributions. We'd love to hear from you.
Okay, well, how about that? I don't know that I can shoehorn $25 an hour into a reconciliation bill any better than I've been able to shoehorn 15 in, which is to say, not at all. We've got some work to do in, on the one hand, we've got some work to do in at least letting people come to understand what traditionally has fit in underneath the framework of reconciliation and the Byrd Rule, of course. But it is time, of course, to see that interpretation of what can fit there expand as well. We spent some time on that yesterday, and the question of whether or not to, let's say, ignore the parliamentarians' advice and rule differently, and what might be the result of doing that. In fact, we can spend a little bit of time on that, too. There's Greg had mentioned the other day that there is a theory under which you might be able to engineer an inclusion of the minimum wage in a reconciliation bill that would really require, of course, standing all of the rules, precedents, interpretations of the Byrd Rule and reconciliation rules, etc., on its head, and simply ignore, just damn the torpedoes, go straight ahead. We're going to put this thing in here no matter what. The problem, of course, still comes back to the issue of, do you have your votes lined up so that you can follow this up with a victory? That we can discuss a little bit later on, I suppose. But let me roll into segment 4 here, just so I can keep up with the times. I'd like to get through our 6 segments, our 5th and 6th perhaps tomorrow, so that we can have it all on the record before Senate action gets too far underway. None of these things, I don't think at this point, we're going to be able to effect as changes, although there will be an opportunity to do so if the House and Senate opt to iron out whatever differences there may be in the reconciliation bills that they pass in conference. Most of the rules, Byrd Rule included, still will apply to what comes out of conference, but it's not entirely true that once a bill is on the floor, there is no opportunity to make amendments like this. Conference, actually, we do very frequently see usually smaller scale changes, but many of them made. But conference has sort of fallen into disfavor in the last couple of years. I guess with the rise of partisanship and all votes being as divided on partisan lines on major legislation as they have been, no one is eager to no one's eager to enter into negotiations. That's a difficult spot to be in, and no one is eager to add any more votes and voting processes to the procedure than are absolutely necessary. Let me roll through segment 4 here, though, and get some more of these ideas on the record, and we'll push forward after this.
Hello, this is Rich, also known as Liberal Thinking. I represent a strong progressive view within the Democratic Party. Previously, I suggested progressives support the American Rescue Plan, now pending in Congress, but with changes to better respond to the coronavirus and its economic aftermath. One of the changes that would benefit the country is to allocate monthly payments for all working-age people who are not fully employed. The current package is designed to add on to the existing unemployment compensation system, but that system is inadequate in good times and woefully inadequate in the current pandemic. The current system was designed for the industrial age, where economic downturns typically lasted 6 to 18 months. We live in an information age, where manufacturing is a smaller part of the economy. Most people are not unemployed because factories are temporarily idled. People tend to be unemployed because their jobs were shipped off to another country, or they are not trained for the kind of work available. They are increasingly out of work because their job was automated out of existence. These people are never going to get work in the current environment because even if they are retrained, there are no jobs for them to take. They are not just suffering from the pandemic downturn, they are victims of capitalism. Many countries address this flaw with welfare. People who cannot be employed were given income so they can subsist, but the United States has never had welfare. It has unemployment compensation, which is intended for economic downturns. Until the economy recovers, we should simply provide subsistence income for all adults 18 to 67 who are not employed full-time. That income should be enough for essential food, clothing, and housing for the duration of the pandemic. And this unemployment assistance should be free from federal income tax, so that all of the assistance actually goes to helping the recipients. It could then be counted against any normal entitlements so that people are not double dipping. But given the economic situation, where the pandemic is piling its burdens on top of the normal problems of finding work, a minimum payment for all working age persons is appropriate, at least until people can work free from the worry that COVID will kill them. Please join me in urging your representatives in Congress to make changes to the American Rescue Plan so that it will better serve the country. You can find Enhancing the American Rescue Plan, along with other posts by Liberal Thinking, in the All Daily Coast Progressives group. Join our group and make your own contributions. We'd love to hear from you.
All right, thanks very much. Catching us up here, Rich. All right, so pushing the boundaries on all these things. Again, whether or not they are things that we feel it's realistic to be able to push through in terms of changes to the American Rescue Plan here, that's a little iffy, true, but it's never too late to start thinking about suggestions. Like I said, for the next round, for tweaks that we might be able to push through either on the floor in the Senate or in conference. But also just good ammunition for getting you to think differently and expand the horizons a little bit. Excellent point, I think, about the way we've structured what economic assistance, direct economic assistance we have to this point permitted ourselves in this country. And it's a good point. It is sort of an outdated system, engineered for an industrial age and less let's say less well suited to service economy, and certainly what we've now gotten used to, the short-term gig economy. It doesn't really make sense to continue the industrial era unemployment assistance framework as opposed to moving a little bit closer towards, I guess, what they're now calling the universal basic income type model. Whether that's universal or simply for those in, I guess, lower income levels seeking to boost incomes and minimize inequality. But all those things certainly on our mind these days. So thanks, Rich. We'll roll into segments 5 and 6 tomorrow. And I encourage you all to, by the way, take up the mantle, do the same, and send us your thoughts, whether it's original writing of your own or reflections on an article that you've found particularly interesting but that haven't gotten the attention that you think that they deserve here on the show. As a matter of fact, winding up this series by Friday, I hope to have ready for us, and perhaps a little bit earlier, another submission from another friendly listener who is taking us up on precisely that offer to redirect our attention. Not enough attention at this point paid to the broader topic of public banking. I believe we've touched peripherally on the subject in covering David Dayen's writings about postal banking. Similar subject and similar in concept in terms of the public nature of the banking program and what would be perhaps necessary to create legal space for it so that it could thrive, but this time focusing more directly on public banking as opposed to putting the post office to use as a substitute for a public banking system. All right, let's see. What other fun things have we got to share with you here? There's plenty. Let's see. Maybe we'll try this one here, since we were talking earlier about what the House is moving on to this week in addition to the For the People Act. This Politico piece from last week caught my eye, and I thought perhaps we ought to spend a little bit of time on it. House Democrats brace for floor fights with raw post-riot emotions. Interesting. And what floor fights should we be anticipating, if not looking forward to? Subheader here reads, unity tests are looming as many Democrats admit they're still struggling to navigate a political landscape reshaped by the January 6th insurrection. Let's not forget how powerful a moment that was for a lot of reasons. Though it seems the people being arrested one by one would probably hope that we might forget about it. And even more interesting stories piling up there, and I think I've got a couple of them perhaps tucked away in pocket. We'll see if we can get around to those. But for now, Sarah Ferris and Heather Kagro on this piece, datelined the 25th, so the end of last week, again in Politico. House Democrats have stayed in lockstep on their $1.9 trillion pandemic relief bill. Once they pass it, though, the real battle will begin. Excellent. And what I love having is over here the alarm turned way, way up so that it makes plenty of noise. I wonder why that happened. Okay, our break, therefore, just 30 seconds or so away from cueing the music, so not too much we'll be able to fit in on the article before taking the break. Wish I had gone in a different direction. But I'll set it up for you. What about that real battle? What's it going to be all about? After they vote to pass the COVID aid package, expected as soon as Friday, and of course that did happen, though the passage didn't occur until the wee hours of Saturday morning. Democrats will then enter a 3-week stretch packed with political minefields that will test the limits of their razor-thin majority and potentially determine the fate of the rest of President Joe Biden's agenda. Very dramatic. But then again, we have very dramatic music playing in the background. So we'll continue with this article and find out what's at stake and find out what might divide the Democrats. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Okay, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. So let's see, where we left off just before our break, let's see what the Politico folks this time think might divide the ranks of the Democrats as they move forward with their agenda. And I thought there were some legit points in here, actually, so that's why I'm going forward with it. Not just a shocking headline that I decided to read for you. I did actually skim this one a little bit over the weekend. So what's up here? Let's see. Of course, that means the Democrats in the House, teeing up challenging votes on highly charged issues from immigration to policing reform to labor rights. A legislative sprint set to expose ideological splits in the caucus that have only intensified since November's election, sliced Speaker Nancy Pelosi's majority to a 5-vote margin. Representative Anthony Brown, a Democrat of Maryland, said Democratic leaders must work gingerly, that's the quote, gingerly, to keep their members together on the floor, particularly on what he termed messaging bills that have little chance in the 50-50 Senate and already generate internal divisions. And this is some interesting dynamics that you probably always figured were going on behind the scenes, and sometimes we've explicitly stated must absolutely be happening behind the scenes, though we may have no proof of it, and other times we are offered proof, and here we've got it. So let's roll with it and explain what's going on. Anthony Brown, again, pointing out here about those messaging bills. It's odd, when you're controlling both chambers and the White House, and you're still doing messaging bills. That's going to kill us in the midterms, Brown said. But he added, the Speaker's a master at this. Not everybody thinks so. Not everybody who has reservations about it disagrees either. But this is a real tightrope that she's going to have to walk here. And the idea, as he says, of doing messaging bills, I think that's what a lot of people are a little concerned about that. And I just happened to see, actually, Brian Beutler discussing that topic exactly. At least I think so. Let me bring that tweet back up so we can go back to it, I guess, perhaps, after we get through this article. Maybe the thing to do is to plow through the article and lay out all the other issues. Oh, well, actually, they may depart from this. I guess I'll pause on it at this point then and say, so what Congressman Brown is concerned about here, focusing on messaging bills. This is, of course, what Democrats spent their time on last Congress while they were still seeking to, last Congress and the Congress before. Ordinarily, it's something you see people do either from the minority or perhaps when in the majority in the House and there's no Democratic majority in the Senate. And now we're finding yet a third opportunity, I guess you could call it, to work on messaging bills, having a majority in both houses, but not large enough that you can actually get any of these things done. Messaging bills, essentially, what we've come to understand them as, are a substitute for actually governing with a legislative agenda when you know that your legislative agenda, through whatever combination of circumstances, isn't going to stand a very good chance of being enacted into law, either because you don't control the other legislative house, or you do, but the majority is so narrow, or perhaps a presidential veto stands in the way, and you simply chart out this position and say, well, we'll make it clear that we support such and such a thing, and by the next election, the people will remember. Okay, well, we may or may not be back on the air at this point. Pardon me, everybody. We had a complete and total power outage that took out everything from the main computer running the show, even the backup computers, basically, that could have perhaps run the show, plus, of course, the Wi-Fi router, which makes the whole thing run that much more smoothly. But I guess that's a sign. I was back out shopping for gigantic battery backups for the whole system, just in case of just such an emergency. And I guess it heard me thinking about it, and rather concerning the way the lights actually did go out. There was a little, dimming and flickering of the lights, and then pop, and everything was gone, and reminding us of the shortcomings of the battery backup system. But Scott says thumbs up, and we're back on, so here we go. Well, we'll have a giant gap in the show. We couldn't even record while off the air because, of course, there was no power to do so. So, all right, back to Best Buy, I guess, this weekend. I was just there, too. And we'll tell you the saga of the dishwasher some other time. Okay, so where we left off, remember that? When we were talking about the option of using messaging bills to try to convince the electorate that it was worthwhile putting Democrats back in charge in both houses of Congress and in the White House so that they could deliver their legislative agenda. Of course, it won't take much connecting the dots here to realize that we're also, of course, now sitting in majorities, at least ostensible majorities in both houses and in the occupying the White House, and still lots of questions about what we can deliver in terms of legislative agenda. That is an issue. And I said Brian Beutler was touching on it this morning. I happened to see a short tweet thread of his responding to Matt Iglesias. Matt Iglesias having commented, "There's something really broken with the prevailing political organizing model on the left, that it seems to incentivize doing campaigns that are clearly doomed to failure and bound to leave people ending up angry and frustrated. This could be a problem if that's exactly what's going on." He's, of course, referring to the tweet from Alice Miranda Olstein, who has this to say. She's a healthcare reporter on Capitol Hill for Politico, commenting that an exclusive to this morning's huddle for Politico. 150 former Bernie Sanders staffers, surrogates, and supporters wrote to the senator urging him to push for a path to citizenship in the next reconciliation bill. And plenty of well-known participants in our Twitter circles apparently signing on to this letter. And, you know, of course, immediately what jumps out to a lot of people, not just Matt Iglesias as well, path to citizenship and immigration issues not traditionally the sort of substantive legislating that can be done under a reconciliation framework. And this is problematic. And Matt's pointing that out, that we have people who have been, well, essentially people who've been promised for some time now by Bernie Sanders and his campaign that these were things that could be done under reconciliation. And, you know, in a sense they can, provided, of course, you have a majority, for one thing, and a unanimous majority in your caucus, if you're only going to have 50 votes, or at least 51 solid votes among the Democrats for that procedure we've been discussing for the past day or so, ignoring the advice of the parliamentarian and engineering the inclusion of extraneous materials in a reconciliation bill despite the strictures of the Byrd rule. That's not something that we often have readily at hand, and it makes for a problematic promise. And then you find yourself saying things like, well, you know, it's technically feasible and we can technically do it, but I don't know that we could. You know, I certainly didn't do the work of organizing 51 votes in the Senate for it ahead of time. I was hoping that we could raise public pressure for it, and that the times themselves and public pressure for, you know, a different kind of times would force everyone's hand so that they would feel comfortable, or at least feel like it was something they had to do, absolutely had to push for this sort of, parliamentary, what do we say, sharp elbows, I guess, to get this thing done. Brian then commenting on Matt Iglesias's comment here, saying, I think what's happened is that over time people have grown increasingly aware of the absurdities of the Senate and the senators' insistence on hiding behind those absurdities. So some bluffs are being called. If Dems say they support a pathway to citizenship, but can only do 2 filibuster-proof bills a year, and those are only for taxes, unless the vice president says otherwise. Oh, lots of misconceptions about that, by the way. But long story short, so that we can continue with this tangent, not get into another one, lots of information, bad information circulating that would appear to indicate that it is the vice president's prerogative stepping into the role as Senate president to overrule the parliamentarian. But the parliamentarian can be ignored or overruled by whoever is in the chair presiding over the Senate. It doesn't need to be the vice president, and we'll explain perhaps why people came to that incorrect conclusion later on. But that's the bottom line, is any presiding officer can do it, doesn't have to be the VP. But as Brian was saying, if Dems say they support a pathway to citizenship, but can only do 2 filibuster-proof bills a year, and those are really only for taxes, unless the VP or any presiding officer and a majority of senators to back up that presiding officer says otherwise, well, then we'll probably lose power in 2 years. Although I lost power just a few minutes ago, but I got it back. Didn't help much. Anyway, if all of this is true, what do you think advocates are going to demand? And he continues on here saying, one reason I'm thrilled to see filibuster abolition go mainstream, and which I've been bleeding about for about 15 years, yeah, me too, is that as constituted, it inverts accountability. When a bill fails in, quote unquote, the Senate, it's usually because of the minority, not the party in charge. Likewise, as constituted, the filibuster allows an out party to say, vote us in. We support X, Y, and Z, even when they know they aren't unified around those things, because they know the filibuster will prevent them from becoming law. That worked until filibuster reform went mainstream. What's happening now is that too many people have come to understand that the rules are mostly artifice, and so if promises go unfulfilled, it means they were just empty to begin with. By the way, whoops, sorry about taking filibuster reform mainstream. Anyway, needless to say, that's a catastrophe for a majority party that promises a lot of things that require new legislation. Now you got to keep them. All right, so good observations there. I think all very useful, and let's mark that for inclusion in the roundup. And turn from there back to where we were with Politico. Anthony Brown, Democrat of Maryland, criticizing the continuing reliance on messaging bills here. Democrats are moving legislation at a rapid clip for now, in the House anyway, fast-tracking bills that were passed in the last Congress. They're eager to show their base the type of progress that can come from electing Democrats to take full control of Washington. But taking big swings can mean taking big risks. And unity tests are looming as many Democrats admit they're still struggling to navigate a political landscape reshaped by the January 6th insurrection. Forgot that this was even a part of this calculation. Their lingering distrust of GOP colleagues who opposed certification of President Joe Biden's win spilled out onto the House floor after weeks of emotional conversations in private, threatening to hobble any chance of cross-aisle work in the House. And this is a real interesting example of it. It all started as lawmakers from both parties packed the steps of the Capitol on Tuesday night for a candlelight vigil marking 500,000 U.S. deaths from the coronavirus. Behind closed doors, Pelosi's team was hustling to avoid an embarrassing defeat on the most mundane of congressional business, a bill to name a post office. And I think that's right. That is among the most mundane pieces of regular congressional business. Now, how would that come to a point where it might actually fail? And, not that it was a big tragedy if it did fail, but what was going on here? What would cause somebody to get in the way of this? Well, Representative Sean Casten, Democrat of Illinois, angered Democratic leaders by forcing a roll call vote on the bill, wanting to send a message. This is interesting. Like, why would you get in the way of this? I know at first I'm sure I would be thinking, well, the leadership is pissed off about this. Why are you doing this? And what do you hope to gain by this? And I would ask that question too. And I guess he had a good answer. I mean, I think it's a good answer. Casten did this wanting to send a message that Democrats wouldn't work with Republicans who have refused to denounce the pro-Trump rioters of January 6th. I don't know who introduced that bill for the post office renaming, but I gather from the way this is reported that this was the sponsorship work of a Republican who had in fact voted not to certify whatever states, I don't know whether all the states they voted for that had their electors challenged or whatever, but any one of them certainly would probably do the trick. And Casten's got a good point. Why should you be delivering the routine, easy stuff? I know it's not like big ticket legislation that the guy can run for president on, whoever sponsored it, but it's something that they want to deliver at home. But why should they have the luxury of being able to do that, utilizing the mechanism of their seat in Congress when they did everything they could to undermine the entirety of our system of government that's delivering this opportunity, normally would be delivering this opportunity for them to go home and say, oh, I did this locally popular thing, leveraging the power of the federal government for you. Why should that be permitted? That's actually a good point. Good question. I don't know if, that's something you spring on people, or maybe he declared his intention to do this and the leadership urged him not to and thought that they had made their point well enough that they anticipated that he had backed off and were wrong, whatever, but maybe not. I don't know. Anyway, so I thought this was a good point. Top Democrats, though, worried that the move would have unforeseen ramifications, effectively torpedoing the House's current practice of allowing quick consideration of non-controversial bipartisan bills by all members. The bill ultimately passed easily. There need to be serious consequences, though, for trying to overturn the results of our election. I think there's just a spectrum in the caucus right now on what that looks like. Said, who are we listening to? AOC. Yes, who was one of 15 Democrats who sided with Kasten on the post office vote. Very interesting. Now, Pelosi and her leadership team must turn their attention to the intra-party fissures ahead as they take up several high-profile bills. Some will be easier than others, such as the long-delayed reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. Other bills on the docket involve tricky politics, whether the immigration status of farm workers or public funding of elections. In only the second month of Democrats' unified power over government, the limits of control are becoming clear. For many Democrats, passing legislation during the last Congress that was likely to run aground in the GOP Senate was one thing. Now that the bills the House passes stand a real chance of becoming law, Democrats are suddenly looking harder at their own decisions, which they really should have been doing the whole time, but you understand. But this is a real interesting dynamic. Well, let's run through it here. I know we're going to have a lot of political to and froing, but I think this is going to be a very productive Congress, House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer said. That dynamic is complicating this week's passage of a sweeping voting rights and government reform bill, one of the Democrats' highest priorities from last Congress. Senior Democrats are confident they will pass the bill, which carries the high priority ranking of H.R. 1, but an influential group of Congressional Black Caucus leaders, several of them from the South, are raising objections to a provision that would require states to cede control of their redistricting decisions to independent commissions. We've been on this ground before, both with the Colorado provision when Travis and Rachel sent us their commentary on that, and as Virginia considered a similar proposal, and I ended up, I think, voting against it on the same grounds that we heard about from Colorado, and which I imagine CBC members also have in mind here. Let's read on here. The CBC members fear such a massive overhaul could be weaponized by Republican-controlled legislatures to undermine black voters, but the bill's supporters say there are protections already in place under law. Of course, many of those may be undermined by the Supreme Court later on this week. Representative Hank Johnson of Georgia, who likely will oppose H.R. 1 without a change to redistricting language, said he had the same qualms when the bill passed in 2019, and presumably with his vote, too. But it's simply tougher to support the expansive bill now, he explained, since the provision he objects to could actually become law this Congress. Last year, H.R. 1 was more aspirational, Johnson said in an interview. You have to be more careful about what you let go to the Senate. It's true. It's always supposed to be true, but we ignore it sometimes. This is a great behind-the-scenes dynamic being exposed here. Top Democrats, including Representatives Zoe Lofgren of California, John Sarbanes of Maryland also, have been privately meeting with CBC members to hear their concerns. Some CBC members have also heard from former Attorney General Eric Holder, who's leading Democrats' national redistricting overhaul effort. Lofgren and Sarbanes huddled with Pelosi, Hoyer, and Majority Whip Jim Clyburn last Wednesday on this issue. CBC Chair Joyce Beatty of Ohio said those discussions are helping to whittle down the number of her members who oppose the bill, which she called a good sign, though she declined to say whether she was prepared to support the legislation. I think there's a lot of great stuff in the bill, but obviously I want to make sure we don't dilute minority representation, she said, noting there is still some talk of amending the language, so it's not entirely closed, right? The bill is expected to reach the floor next week, now this week, and we're seeing it happen today, along with another broadly popular bill from last Congress that's run into new headwinds this year, and the Democrats' sweeping policing reform bill, A group of moderates are attempting to roll back language that seeks to hold police officers legally accountable for alleged misconduct, changing a doctrine known as qualified immunity. The centrists pushing back on the issue all backed the policing bill last summer. They argue that keeping the qualified immunity provision as written would tank negotiations with the roughly 10 Republicans who would need to support the bill in the Senate. Most Democrats, though, argue that the language is a crucial piece of holding officers responsible for any crimes committed on the job. And I know we've been over the concept, not intensely on the show, but I think we all sort of innately understand that that's going to need some work at a minimum. Okay, for the next 2 years, the group of just 5 House Democrats, a group anyway, have the power to tank any bill they don't like by voting no on the floor. So far, none have shown the willingness to blow it up. Privately, some members believe such a stunning moment could happen soon, but acknowledge they face intense pressure to stay together. Meanwhile, the bad feelings in the wake of January 6th remain unresolved for many Democrats. More on that after this. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Oh yes, where did we leave off here? I'm messaging with Joan. Joan wondering, will our technical difficulties get in the way of a call today? But I think we're under control now, although I didn't get a chance to figure out whether this was like a neighborhood outage or just our house or what. But now the more I think about it, the more annoyed I am that I didn't take advantage of the opportunity to have the battery back up in place. I figured, oh, we've made it this far. I think we've had 1 or 2 power outages during the show in 10 years or so. So I figured we could make it until next weekend or so when I finished finally the task of figuring out, okay, how much will I really need to spend in order to back everything up? And I think I've got a good idea about that now. So, all right, hopefully we can get it in place before that ever happens again. But where we left off with this Politico article, leading into the issue of the January 6th insurrection changing dynamics within the Democratic caucus going forward. But yeah, so far, I think this article has done a pretty good job of laying out what pressures changed for Democrats behind the scenes, such that they were all voting for these same bills last Congress without much hesitation. But now the possibility of actually enacting it into law creates new pressures. It's interesting. I wonder how many, if they can only afford to lose 5 votes, that is very precarious, obviously. And interesting because we usually say in a situation like this, as we see in the Senate, where there are just fewer moving parts and it's easier to pinpoint pivot points like this by saying, well, okay, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are a new power center, according to them, in the Senate because they are pivotal votes in getting to 50. But of course, anybody else can become that pivotal vote as well. And they'd be wise to start exercising some of that. And I guess here, the Congressional Black Caucus taking advantage of that opportunity, seeing a problem that's a very serious one, they give early notice to the fact that if you swing, say, a little bit further out to try and shore up the usual question marks among the more conservative Democrats so that you don't lose your 5 votes there, you do run the risk of losing your 5 votes elsewhere. And if the CBC is the locus for those 5, well, great. So much the better. It pays. It should pay off once in a while. Providing the base and therefore the basis for Democratic majorities in the House and Senate and Joe Biden in the White House, well, that should bring some leverage with it. And we'll see whether it does on the question of redistricting commissions. And how strongly they stick to that point. But it'd be nice to see the pivotal votes swing away from the control of more conservative-leaning Democrats for once. All right, let's get back into this article. We had mentioned that, meanwhile, bad feelings in the wake of January 6th remain unresolved for many Democrats. There's lingering anger within the caucus about what several Democrats privately described as their leadership's failure to start a, quote, family conversation until this week about interacting with Republicans in a post-January 6th world. Senior Democrats counter that there's no way they could institute any kind of caucus-wide policy on the issue and say they have addressed it in numerous conversations before this week. Kasten defended himself on a private caucus call midweek, saying he didn't want to be ostracized as the Thomas Massie of the left, according to several people listening, referring to a Kentucky House Republican who has alienated many in his conference. But Kasten is one of several Democrats who have drafted their own kind of blacklist, refusing to work with any GOP members who supported Trump's efforts to overturn the election. And it's a plausible position. Although, I guess I would say, it's obviously something you could do and decide to stick to. But yeah, it will put you in some uncomfortable positions like opposing post office renaming bills that you don't oppose on substance, but are opposing because of who sponsored the bill. And, at least some of that has got to be legitimate, especially if they engage in activity like the activity they engaged in on January 6th. It makes a certain amount of sense. But then again, I guess it has to be balanced against look, we're Democrats and we just approach the responsibilities of governance differently. This is not something that we oppose on substantive grounds, and so therefore we go ahead with it. But on the other hand, again, I think in the end I have to give the other side two cracks at it, because I guess that's where my inclinations lie. I could be talked out of it under certain circumstances. I'm not wedded to the position, but I don't oppose on substance renaming post offices, but at the same time, so what if the post office isn't renamed? I mean, I have no objection substantively to not renaming the post office, and so why isn't that a perfect opportunity to make this sort of point? Nothing serious and necessary for the welfare of the people at large is at stake in renaming the post office, even if it's being renamed for someone that they hold in high regard and they would very much like to see the renaming done. Most people really don't notice and don't care. Back to the article here. After having mentioned that Kasten is one of several Dems who have their own sort of blacklist following the January 6th insurrection, House Financial Services Chair Maxine Waters said on this same call where they were hashing things out that she didn't plan to bring up bills in her committee that were co-sponsored by those Republicans, according to two Democrats. Well, that's a more substantial roadblock for Republicans. Not that it was likely that she would be bringing up a lot of their financial services bills anyway. But on the call, Pelosi and other Democratic leaders advised each member to do what's right for their districts, while underscoring that they wouldn't allow the full institutional breakdown that would result if Democrats stopped working with Republicans outright. Although in a majoritarian body like the House, why that's such a worry, I'm not certain. But I guess with margins of just 5, that's the issue. Well, if you're going to wholesale blacklist entire swaths of the Republican conference, even those who didn't join in this activity might take offense at that and decide to swipe back, although there's only like 10 of you. Anyway, in the context of interacting with those who continue to provide aid and comfort to violent insurrections, House Democratic Caucus Chair Hakeem Jeffries said, well, everyone's going to have to make individual decisions, which actually strikes me as perhaps the wrong approach. Maybe there should be a unified caucus position on what to do with insurrectionists, but it's hard to tell whether you're doing the right thing and painting them all with the same broad brush when there's actual substantive legislation at stake. And yeah, I mean, they are human and they could take things the wrong way, and instead of saying, look, you're justified in being annoyed, angry, upset, and vindictive about an insurrection against our form of government, but that doesn't mean you can't let these things on which we agree go undone. Except those things on which we agree are not substantive enough to worry about getting done one way or the other. It's a nice convenience, but I guess call me when you're interested in working on something that will actually change people's lives, and then we could probably shoehorn in the post office renaming for you along the way as well. Interesting dynamics, all of them, and I thought it was important to share some of those. Let's see. Here's something perhaps less important to share, but interesting nonetheless, and I picked it up because only this show would have the time to share it. Something in the Hill, the bizarre backstory of the filibuster by Robert E. May, contributed as an opinion article. Who's Robert May? We have to scroll all the way down to the bottom to figure that one out. But Robert May, Professor Emeritus of History at Purdue University, and the author of, I'm sure many things, but here included are the Manifest Destiny's Underworld, Filibustering in Antebellum America, and other books and essays about filibusters. His most recent book, Yuletide in Dixie, Slavery, Christmas, and Southern Memory. Boy, I think he's still anti-slavery, but it's a suggestive title. But what's really interesting about this work that he's done here on the filibuster is it's not the filibuster you're thinking of. This was something I wasn't entirely aware of. I was aware of the very first bit here, which we get to about how they chose the name, but wait till you hear the rest of this. And if you are a history buff, you'll say, well, of course this is the case. But, well, I don't know. You haven't sent me a segment, a recorded segment saying so I can't prove that you already knew this. As Senators Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer dance around whether or not the Senate should end the filibuster's stranglehold over legislation, it is instructive to recall the terms linguistic roots and original meaning. This is the part I knew. The rest of it, no. Derived from a Dutch word for freebooter, the Dutch word being, I guess, probably sounds an awful lot like it. I don't know how you would pronounce this, but probably something like freebooter. So let's say Vrijbuiter. It's Vrijbuiter. I love those Dutch spellings. But the Dutch word for freebooter, the word first appeared in English before the Civil War. In those days, when Americans spoke of filibusters, they meant not what we think of as filibusters, but they meant private armed groups mounting criminal military expeditions against foreign countries from U.S. territory. Wow. Of course, that made me immediately think of private armed groups mounting criminal military expeditions against the Capitol, but that's not what they're talking about. Again, private armed groups mounting criminal military expeditions against foreign countries from the U.S., from U.S. territory. Not only were such invasions of other sovereignties illegal under the U.S. Neutrality Act of 1818, like piracy, they violated international law. Such assaults alarmed governments and legal theorists because they risked triggering unwanted wars. The unwanted kind of war. Yeah. To grasp the danger, one only need ponder what might happen today if groups of Americans with AK-47s attacked Hong Kong on China's coast, or Russian positions in the Crimea, or the capital. Yes, I know it's not a foreign territory, but still. But yeah, those would be quite alarming, right? On January 6th, far-right extremists attacking the U.S. Capitol, revealed in a domestic context the peril of escalation when random groups of armed private citizens assume the right to determine national policy by armed force. Filibusters before the Civil War put nations on both sides of the Atlantic in jeopardy of fighting unsought wars. And I guess it's something we haven't really thought about in the modern context until very recently, with the rise of private militias and private armed forces and the Blackwater contractor type context. But I guess also militias as well, I suppose, if they directed their aggression elsewhere. It just... for most of the post-war era, I guess, and the modern, actually, I guess probably the whole 20th century and on, when national militaries sort of grew to the scale that just really wouldn't be, manageable by private armed groups in terms of actually prevailing in the warfare. But I suppose things have equalized somewhat these days in terms of what sort of military hardware has ended up in private hands. Anyway, throughout the nation's history, starting long before the term was even coined, filibustering intruded into U.S. politics. Few Americans today are aware, despite all the focus on impeachment in the last year, that America's first impeachment trial during the John Adams administration concerned an accused filibuster. And again, here, the use of the terminology is a little awkward. But a filibuster is, I guess, in this case, not the thing that you do to the Senate or, even the attack that you launch, but a participant in one of those attacks. A person who filibusts, I guess. An accused filibuster, not a filibusterer, but filibuster. This U.S. Senator William Blount, who, in fact, was the, I think, first impeachment to come to trial, certainly, and the conclusion there being, well, that impeachment wasn't the mechanism that you would use to remove a member of the U.S. Senate. You would go with the expulsion process instead, both still requiring a 2/3 vote, of course, so that didn't make any particular difference. Anyway, what was that all about? That Tennessean, William Blount, was tried for organizing an invasion of Spanish North American territory beyond U.S. borders. We talked about the fact that he was impeached, but we didn't really talk about why. Before the Civil War, almost all of America's best remembered politicians, Clay, Calhoun, Lincoln, Douglas, Webster, Davis, Jackson, Polk, Seward, among them. Again, the whole sentence here. Before the Civil War, almost all of America's best remembered politicians were compelled to stake out positions on filibustering because the expeditions were simply so salient politically, diplomatically, and sectionally. It is shocking to discover how many times in the 1840s and 1850s private American filibustering groups attacked foreign countries. There's a link here to, I guess, some accounting of how many times it actually did happen. I'm going to open it up and take a look. Those headline-grabbing aggressions were mostly aimed at Cuba, then a Spanish colony, but also at Mexico and other Central American countries where Britain still had colonial holdings. So it may have been in large part anti-British. Anyway, but rumors abounded that filibusters also planned invasions against other parts of the world, such as Ireland, then also still a part of the United Kingdom, and the independent kingdom of Hawaii as well. So good morning, Hawaiians, when you get this podcast. During the 1850s, any well-read American would have known who the filibusters were, and probably well-read Hawaiians now know this too, because, of course, it was conquered territory for the most part. Okay, not only were they constantly in the news, these filibusters, but they turned up in novels, short stories, and theatrical productions, even sheet music. Of all the filibusters, the one who conquered Nicaragua gained the greatest fame, William Walker, a well-educated Tennessean, and again, Tennessee, like maybe too involved in all of this. Another well-educated Tennessean who wound up in California during the gold rush, launched several filibuster expeditions against Mexico and Central America before dying at the hands of a Honduran firing squad in 1860, a couple of months before Abraham Lincoln's election as president. Known as the gray-eyed man of destiny, who got shot, and the only American filibuster to take over a foreign land in the 1850s, Walker manipulated his own rise to Nicaragua's presidency in a June 1856 election that might be instructive to modern congressional Republicans needing guidance in what stolen elections really look like. Prior to being booted out of Nicaragua in 1857 by an alliance of Central American countries, Walker legalized slavery there. Wow, that's a nice thing to do. A year after Walker's expulsion during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln alluded to Walker indirectly when he indicted, when he indicted filibustering as the process of seeking wider slave fields. Walker was not nationally known before turning filibuster, but John A. Quitman and a number of other filibusters did have national profiles. Today, one can find places named for Quitman throughout the South. A two-time governor of Mississippi, he gained his greatest fame as a leading American general in the war with Mexico. Quitman led the U.S. Army into Mexico City in the war's climactic battle, becoming the capital's military governor during the U.S. occupation. Twice after the war, he was a serious contender for the Democratic Party's vice presidential nomination. On another occasion, he ran for vice president on a third-party ticket. Between 1850 and 1855, Quitman helped organize filibuster expeditions to wrest Cuba from Spain's grasp, and once it was independent, to get the island annexed to the U.S. as one or more new states, following Texas's precedent. For part of that time, he intended to personally command the filibuster army. Later in the century, filibustering diminished, except for a brief revival in the Fenian movement, I don't know whether that's Fenian or Fenian, F-E-N-I-A-N, movement to Canada during the Johnson and Grant administrations, and a few plots against Cuba and Mexico, just a few random plots to take over, especially some expeditions to Cuba in the war, or rather in the lead up to the Spanish-American War. The term, though, by then was so embedded in the English language that rather than disappear, it emigrated to new linguistic and very political terrain. We should not be surprised that after the Civil War, when Americans had mostly had their fill of war, the term filibustering was increasingly attached to a different form of aggression, the idea of obstructing legislation by talking it to death. As filibustering faded away as a word for military aggression, it naturally morphed into political applications for aggressively stalling laws. In fact, even before the Civil War, it was occasionally applied to obstruction in Congress by lengthy speech-making. Today, congressional filibustering doesn't require interminable speech-making, but it is still aggression. That the term filibustering originated in criminal aggression, of course, hardly justifies its automatic disqualification in a political context. Throughout our history since the late 1800s, large numbers of lawmakers of diverse ideologies have embraced filibustering as a legislative option in their legislative toolboxes. But if we really believe, as the Article 1, Section 8 of the the Article 1, I can get rid of the. As Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution states that Congress can legislate for the general welfare of the United States, it is wrong to allow an undemocratic minority to perpetually cripple that power, just as the 19th century filibustering faded from public concern, so should its 21st century iteration. So a little bit of filibuster reform endorsement there at the end. But an interesting background. I mean, it doesn't really, like you said, it doesn't, doesn't work as an argument for getting rid of the filibuster to point out that it was originally descriptive of illegal military aggression, but it doesn't help either. It's just interesting background and might help you in interpreting any original historical sources that you might be reading from prior to the Civil War, which might be mentioning filibusters and filibustering in a context that seems unfamiliar and confusing. Now you'll know. All right, let's see. Other things that we ought to bring up before taking our last break and heading into our last segment and speaking with Joan. Let's see. I've got an interesting thread here, which is rather lengthy, actually. We'll see. Do we have time for that one? A lengthy thread inspired by the sight of the golden Trump idol seen at CPAC. And this perhaps shorter but more involved item that we might be able to actually shoehorn in here before the break. Why don't we go with this one? Because it's news we have let slide for the last couple of days and really need to get back to it. Mark Sumner will rely on here from the front page of Daily Kos, also end of last week. Long buried report shows that Trump knew Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Salman murdered the journalist Jamal Khashoggi, or at least okayed his murder. It's basically impossible. The conclusion was that it was impossible for it to have happened without bin Salman's knowledge and tacit approval, given the position he holds in the country. So Mark puts it this way. In October of 2018, Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi stepped into a Saudi embassy in Istanbul. It was a consulate, in fact, just point that out, to deal with what was supposed to be routine paperwork related to his upcoming marriage. His fiancée was waiting outside, and he never returned. Maybe it was an embassy. Maybe it was the consular section of the embassy itself. I don't know. That's not the important point, though, of course. Though it took months for the details of the story to emerge, it was clear almost from the beginning that Khashoggi had been a victim of Saudi usurper and friend to both Donald Trump and Jared Kushner, Mohammed bin Salman. When more of the story did emerge, it could not have been more disturbing. It showed how bin Salman dispatched a murder squad to intercept Khashoggi, beat him, tortured him, dismembered him, and then murdered him, in that order. It kind of has to go in that order. When the journalist was dead, a member of the team that had killed him donned his clothing and walked around Istanbul in an effort to plant a false trail. Finally, it seems that Khashoggi's remains were burned in an oven specially created for that purpose, which is also a little bit disturbing, to say the very least. And what have we here? An embedded tweet here from Mark here. I have no information to go along with this, but basically the tweet of Joyce Karam, who announces the release of this report at the end of last week. As the horrific details emerged, Donald Trump continued to stand by bin Salman. Trump refused to sanction the crown prince, who inserted himself into that position, which Mark put in scare quotes here, after conducting an internal coup that saw multiple members of his own family either killed or sent into exile. Trump also refused to produce a required report about the murder, saying that he had the right to refuse the clear letter of the law. There may be no better signal of how President Joe Biden is returning justice to America's foreign policy than this. On Thursday, the White House, last Thursday, of course, will finally release the report, and it clearly shows bin Salman is responsible for the murder of American resident Jamal Khashoggi. You all knew that, but now it's on record, and now we've shared it. On to our next break. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning. I have good news to report. Many more listeners like you are making critical contributions that keep our show on the air. Makes good sense, of course, and patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple. Now you can make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for helping keep you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all of your support. We literally could not do this without you. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Joan McCarter is with us. We've got power. Everything's fine so far. I was just saying during the last return from the break, I was this close. I was actually out shopping for battery backup last weekend, saying you never know when you're going to need this. But I guess I did know when I was going to need it. I didn't realize that's what I knew, but it would have saved us today. But no, the power went out, and I think it might have been the neighborhood. They might have been doing some work here. And hopefully they've given up on any progress or work for the rest of the day, or at least until 11 o'clock. And Joan's with us here, and we'll cross our fingers that this doesn't happen again. So, hey, Joan, what's going on? How you doing?
Good morning. I've got power here.
Oh, okay.
So, you know.
Well,
I can't really take over for you if you lose yours, but I should be here for the duration.
That's good. All right. And, of course, our grids are at least, potentially connected because we're not Texas. And maybe you guys could sell us the power if we need it. It would take a while to get here, I assume. I don't know. Electricity probably travels pretty quickly, right?
I think it travels pretty fast, but I don't know how many transmission lines there are between me and you.
There would probably be a lot, and it probably wouldn't be worth transferring power that far. But anyway,
probably not.
I'm enjoying the fact that I could get help from others if I needed it, unlike Texas, and I like that.
Isn't that a wild thought?
That really is weird. I've compiled a bunch of articles that one day will turn back to that problem because I assume they'll, I don't know. I was going to say I assume that's something they'll want to address and fix, but they seemed, the Republicans, at least ones who didn't feel responsible to anybody, felt like they made a big point of pride of that. Like they were not worried about it and were willing to bet the futures of all the rest of their fellow Texans that they didn't really want help from anybody ever. But I have a feeling that might change in the future.
I think it could change, yeah. And it could change with this infrastructure bill that's probably going to come up fairly soon after the COVID relief bill.
Okay.
At least that's what Senate Democrats kind of want to happen. But we will see. We will see. Because, of course, first the House is going to be doing the For the People Act, as you said earlier. Hopefully we'll also turn to the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act.
Okay. Separate.
Because of what the Supreme Court is doing today.
Yeah, that's the big blind spot for me today. I've seen a lot of writing about it, and I know you've been covering it on the front page. What the hell's going on there? Bring us up to speed on that, if you
well, this is kind of interesting because it centers in Arizona. Kyrsten Sinema's state. Sinema, who wants to keep the filibuster.
Yeah, thanks.
Arizona had 2 election laws that it put through that Democrats challenged. One that would prevent ballot harvesting, and one that would force election officials to toss out all ballots that are cast at incorrect precincts.
Okay.
These are both things that communities of color, in particular, in Arizona have issues with. Lots of very poor communities, people who don't have transportation, people who are disabled. Native American reservations use what they call ballot harvesting. They let other people collect their ballots and deliver them to be voted.
Okay.
Lots of people did this all over the country. In fact, Idaho Republicans, two Idaho Republicans were trying to get rid of it in this state. And the rest of the Republican conference rose up and said, "What are you talking about? This is how my family always votes."
Mm-hmm.
The whole extended family fills in their ballots and one person takes them in.
The other people are cheating with it, but not us.
Not us. So that is one voter suppression bill that's not going to pass in Idaho, at least.
Okay.
But it did pass in Arizona, and Democrats challenged it. The other one, in terms of voting in the wrong precinct, Arizona has this habit, and they probably do it specifically for this reason, of frequently changing polling places. And in communities of color and in poorer areas, putting those polling places in weird, confusing, hard to find places.
Oh, okay.
So these are two voter suppression tactics that they really just solidified in new legislation, which was challenged by Democrats, and that's what the Supreme Court is hearing now. The Ninth Circuit tossed it, but then stayed their ruling. So they were in effect for the 2020 election, and we still managed to squeak through. But if the Supreme Court goes ahead and grants Arizona the right to do this, it really could get what is left of the Voting Rights Act. Mm-hmm. Section 2, which says specifically you cannot do things to keep people of color in particular from voting. You can't have voting laws and policies that discriminate on the basis of race.
Sure.
That's sort of the last thing that's left after Section 5 was gutted by the John Roberts Supreme Court in 2013. Mm-hmm. Section 5 was pre-clearance that states had to, certain states with a history of discrimination in voting had to clear any changes they made to their laws through the federal government, through the Department of Justice, before they could impose them.
Yes. Okay.
That's gone. So Section 2 is basically all that's left, barring voting laws and policies that discriminate on basis of race. But it's an after-the-fact kind of thing. So the state puts these in place, and then your only recourse really is to come back and sue, which is what we're seeing now, and which John Roberts has proven hostile to in the past when he was working in the Reagan administration. He argued against an expansion of Section 2. When he struck down Section 5, he actually specifically wrote, well, Section 2 is there and it's permanent. We'll have it forever. So don't worry about Section 5 going away. There's still this remedy.
Okay.
Now he has this chance to get rid of Section 2. What's he going to do?
Yes. Well, yeah. So we'll see whether he stands by his commitment to the permanence of Section 2 or says, I was wrong. Or the time has come, as is often the argument. Well, yeah, or there's no such thing as racism anymore, or we're post-racist, or whatever else might be offered up.
It's sort of the last part of the Voting Rights Act to give states any kind of pause at all in creating discriminatory voting laws.
Yeah.
Cut the threat that they could get sued. Now, some states like Idaho, they don't care. Idaho,
well, that's true.
For whatever reason, the legislature loves passing messaging laws that they know will be challenged and they know that will lose. Passing laws that the state attorney general says, you can't do that. That's unconstitutional. Don't pass that. And then they pass it. So.
Well, we'll see if it's unconstitutional.
Because they love spending taxpayer dollars on defending message bills in court.
Well, that's an interesting point. Just a sort of a different phase of the game, but messaging just the same. Things that you.
I don't know if other states have this tradition, but it's a thing in Idaho. It's a real thing. It's nuts.
Pointed it out to us before. I remember that happens fairly frequently. It must happen elsewhere, but it seems to be, like you said, it's just a special thing that they aim for. It seems in Idaho.
It's very strange. But anyway, that's where we're at with the Supreme Court.
Okay.
And, it comes at a time when something like 43 states legislatures are looking at some sort of voter suppression bill.
Yeah.
They probably won't pass in all states because those are going to be some Democratic states. But there's 253, I think, is the last count I saw, of bills introduced in the states to restrict voting rights.
Yeah. Right. Well, it's something we've seen before in terms of that number of bills in that number of states, in all likelihood, coming from some central clearinghouse, maybe ALEC, something like that.
Maybe,
but,
yeah.
That's the sort of game plan that they usually implement and make it possible for their Republican, well, anybody, but they tend to be Republican members to essentially pick up the papers. Maybe they download them this year because of COVID instead of going to conventions and picking them up. But ready-made legislation that you need only sign your name to and submit as your own, and then poof, you're one of the 200-plus bills being considered in legislatures around the country, even if they don't go anywhere. It's kind of a scary thing that people are into that.
When you look at the extent to which Trump judges have infiltrated inside district, circuit, and the Supreme Court, it's kind of concerning. Yeah. Which,
All right.
of course, brings us to the Senate. It always brings us back to the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And getting rid of the filibuster and being willing to expand courts.
Okay. Yes, I'd be willing.
On the
Let's do it.
judge's side of it, just the one little sliver that we've talked about in the past, blue slips.
Oh, yeah.
Encouraging news from Dick Durbin,
Good.
who is going to do what Grassley did before him, or Graham, I guess, most recently, and not rely on blue slips for circuit court judges.
Yes.
Which is really important because that was one of the tactics Republicans used to not let Obama have circuit court judges, was say, well, we just won't approve of any. If you don't have my blue slip, you can't bring them to the hearing and you can't pass them out onto the floor and they can't be confirmed.
Yeah.
So.
All right.
So what Durbin's going to do is ignore blue slips for circuit court judges and say, we're going to bring them whether you approve or not. And he says he will possibly do the same for district court judges. For now, he's going to respect blue slips, but if he sees that this is discriminatory against the kind of district court judges Biden says he wants, more representative of people of color, public defenders, people who are not necessarily corporate lawyers. That's who Biden says he wants to get in the district courts, and Durbin says that's what he's going to be upholding. So if he sees people messing around on judges at the district court level, he'll get rid of the blue slips there too.
All right. Well, I mean,
so that's good
decent
news.
Approach, sure. I know some people were worried about the fact that he didn't just outright say chucking the whole thing, but this is as close as you can come to doing. If I see abuse, it's gone. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe you won't see abuse.
I mean, it's better than him,
Sure.
not saying it.
Yeah.
I would like him to say, just no more blue slips, but this is what we got.
All right. Well, it's something you can work with, and it gives them the opportunity to say, I gave them every opportunity to work with us, and they refused to do it, and so therefore, okay.
Apparently, blue slips are actually blue.
Well, good. That would be an interesting thing. Just
We've
to
talked
change
about
the
them
color.
before, but they're the essential pieces of paper that senators signing off on judges nominated from their home states.
Right. And
they've never been an official thing. It's always been a tradition, sort of a courtesy, that, like a lot of Senate procedures, just sort of becomes the thing that you do, like, not firing parliamentarians.
Yeah. I always wondered about, why it was a thing at all. Like, I mean, it makes some sense to say, well, all right, the Constitution, of course, says that we appoint all executive appointees as well as judicial appointees with the advice and consent of the Senate. And I guess this is the advice part. But
and kind of the consent.
Yes, to a certain extent. I just always thought of consent as their approval of the nomination, but this too. Yeah. I mean, certainly the consent of the home state senator, and that's probably closer to the definition of certainly it indicates consent, whereas the blue slip, there might not be any advice attached to that at all. It's just I don't know. I don't know this person, so I'm not signing it, or I do know this person, so I will, or I don't care, so I'll sign it. But presumably, the idea is to give them an opportunity to say, well, advising the president, for instance, as they frequently do. Here are the people that I think should be nominated.
Yeah. I live here, presumably.
Yeah, right.
I know these people. I know how they've represented in the state, so I have an idea whether they'll be good or not.
Yeah.
That's supposed to be what's happening.
That makes a certain amount of sense. If you're
Mitch McConnell, this guy interned for me a decade ago, and he'll do what I want, so here.
Right. This one gives lots of money to the state party. This one is a favor to my senior senator, who I don't know the guy, but he does, and he said if I nominated him, he'd do me a favor later, whatever.
Yeah.
That can happen too.
That's what a lot of it is. But anyway, that's where we're at in
All
judges.
Right.
Not yet talking about expanding courts, but for the time being, if Biden just filled vacancies and filled those senior status taking judges' seats, then it would help a lot. And we'll deal with expanding the courts once we get infrastructure and coronavirus and all of the immediate things dealt with.
Oh, yeah. All those other things. Do we save any money by just using plain white paper on these slips? I'm just curious. Are we paying extra for blue paper or not?
Is blue paper recyclable? I think it probably is.
I guess to some extent, sure. But, I don't know. So I should check into this. Maybe it's time for a change on that front.
On that front. So, the other things where it's time for a change, of course, filibuster.
Yes.
And back to the Voting Rights Act and back to For the People Act the House is passing now.
Right. That's of course, the more, I guess, straight ahead and practical reform than trying to tinker with reconciliation and getting into the question of firing or replacing parliamentarians. Ultimately, really, it's the filibuster that's the issue. Reconciliation isn't an issue if the filibuster isn't.
Exactly. You're not trying to get as much through on 51 votes as you can if the filibuster's gone.
Yeah.
And if we're going to protect voting rights for all eligible voters, then the filibuster has to go.
Yeah.
Because, they're not going to find 10 Republicans. Mitch McConnell is not going to let 10 Republicans go.
Right. And it won't be a difficult task for them either. They're all pretty partisan players, and they're not inclined to cross the aisle, except a few of them at a time, and even then, probably only because they know that there won't be a full 10 coming with them. So
we've seen that play out a lot.
Yes. That happens all the time. The filibuster thing, though, occurs to me also. Maybe a lesser known or lesser or less important reform that it could help with. I'm wondering, very often, as you were talking about the loading up reconciliation bills, with as much as we could to get it through, since it was free from the threat of the filibuster. I wonder if it would help us with decoupling these massive omnibus bills that we see so frequently. We see so many things included either in an attempt to get it past the filibuster because people won't oppose, there'll be some important element in a bill or whatever, or they say, well, we're only willing to go through this exercise of cloture and trying to scrape the votes together once So hang everything you've got on one of these must-pass bills. And I wonder whether we would see smaller, more focused legislation the way I think most people probably prefer these bills to be designed if we didn't have to fight for cloture on every single one.
If the Senate actually had time to do legislation, made time to do legislation, I think it's possible. I think it would. I don't know if at this point the mindset that we have to do these omnibus bills and we have to do them at a deadline and we have to do it with putting as many people in jeopardy as we possibly can of losing everything like we are on March 14th with people's unemployment benefits. If that mindset can be broken, that the only way to get something done is to do it in a huge must-pass bill. You lard it up with as much as you can, and you put a deadline and real actual danger to people's livelihood on the line. I don't know. It would be nice to be able to break that.
It would be.
And I think that's one of the things the Democrats are looking at doing, both in the House and the Senate, in bringing earmarks back.
Oh, yeah. That's
sort of the idea that we can, if you can get nice stuff for your people back home in bills, maybe we'll all work together more happily in getting them passed.
Yeah, that would be helpful. There may be all sorts of ancillary benefits to this, but well, I'm glad it's on the table, and I saw some discussion of it earlier today, just noting, Brian Beutler noting in passing that it has changed the dynamics of elections and caucus politics and messaging politics, that everybody knows now that the filibuster is something you're keeping around as a matter of convenience, or at least some members of the Senate, otherwise preventing us from getting rid of it. But the fact that now everyone knows, if you get your caucus together and put your minds to it, that could be gone and you could do great things, changing the way people think of how they cast their votes, I guess, for Senate in the future. But there's going to be a lot of frustrated people who are going to want explanations for why all the things that they were promised, if they just delivered the Senate into Democratic hands, they would get, and now they're not getting. That's going to create a lot of pressure.
Speaking of the coronavirus relief package,
yes,
where you're not getting $2,000,
right?
You're getting $1,400, and that's if you make less than $75,000 a year, $150,000 a year as a couple. Joe Manchin is still fighting to get that reduced.
Yeah, and I just don't know why.
And he's also arguing that the $400 a week in unemployment boost that people are getting in pandemic unemployment relief, that should be reduced to what Republicans wanted, which is $300 a week. So thanks, Joe Manchin, for getting in and muddying the waters and not letting us just pass the House bill and get this done by March 14th when many unemployment benefits are expiring. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I know he's very excited about being the new power center in the Senate, but you do have 2 years of that ahead of you. It doesn't have to be every day on all things.
Yeah.
That you're the
and you
center
don't
of attention.
have to do things that will harm actual people in a pandemic.
Yes. In West Virginia. I mean...
In West Virginia.
Do they not like money in West Virginia?
Apparently.
My guess
Apparently
is...
they're fine being beat up on by the government.
I guess. That doesn't make much sense to me. I mean, he has made it clear, like, you a lot of you will get this, right? And you want it or you don't want it. I mean, I can't believe there's that many deficit hawks in West Virginia.
Yeah.
They're everywhere, and conservative people tend to fall back on that sort of thing. But I don't know, not when it's tax cuts. But I mean, look, you didn't get any of those tax cuts. Not many of you in West Virginia. One or two people, the guys who run for governor regularly, they got tax cuts. But the rest of you didn't really get any piece of that. And you would get a significant chunk of this. You do want it, but I don't know why I don't know why you deny that you want it, or say you'll vote for Democrats who want it but not for you, or so. I don't really know.
I don't really know either. It's just frustrating as hell.
Yeah.
And I don't.
He doesn't do anything.
Does he think $50,000 annually is gravy train?
I don't see. I mean, maybe it is in some parts of West Virginia, but only because so many people have considerably less than that. And don't you want to do something about that? I can't figure him out, just like we can't figure Sinema out. But he's more frequently quoted and given an opportunity to explain himself, and takes advantage of the opportunity to explain himself.
Yes.
Insofar as he gives them words to print. But when I read them, I am still no less confused by what drives him, because he's internally contradictory.
Long for the days when we had Ben Nelson.
Yeah. I think he was wrong, but more articulate in expressing it. I don't know. Manchin
and not
really
as
just
willing
doesn't...
to completely blow up critical things.
That's
Quite.
True too. I think
he was a better team player when the chips were really down.
Well, it's hard for me to recall that, but
Cornhusker kickback.
Oh yeah.
He would negotiate. He would deal. Manchin just says, "No, I'm not going to do that."
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not certain what it is that does it. I read somewhere, and I ended up. I thought, oh, this is important. This is a rather extensive explanation from Manchin of what he's doing, and I meant to put it aside, and then I think I ended up deciding not to, because I said, this doesn't mean anything. I can't draw anything from this. But I don't know if you happen to have seen his comments in the last couple of days. But now I should have just put them aside just so I could read them aloud and everybody would say the same thing. What? I don't understand what he's talking about. But he was just trying to explain himself, and it made zero sense. I don't know. I'll have to dig it up.
It makes zero sense.
Yeah. I mean,
for anybody who spent any time with the Senate, as you and I have for the past 4 years,
yeah,
it makes zero sense to give Mitch McConnell anything.
Yes.
Any aid.
Yeah, you don't want to do that. And he's made a practice of it. I mean, I don't think it was ever really, that's not his primary intention, but he must at some point realize, well, I'm doing a lot to empower him and should do less. But, yeah, he keeps explaining his position on minimum wage, and it makes no sense. People should get a raise, but just not that much because something... But then he'll say, but then in the same sentence, he'll say, but maybe people don't deserve a raise. I don't know. Maybe they do, maybe they don't.
I don't think he's a deep thinker. Let's just say that about Joe Manchin.
Yeah, and he had some interesting comments about, what was it? The part that confused me a little bit was he didn't want to just break the filibuster rules or break the reconciliation rules because he's seen what power can do to turn good people into corrupt people and something, but then he was on to say, but now I'm the new power center, so I'm going to use it. But wait a second, so it never made any sense. But I assume by next Tuesday he will not make any more sense, but I assume we'll still be talking about him by the time you come around
Probably.
All right.
Maybe by then the Senate will have dealt with the bill. I don't know. They're going to try to start bringing it up tomorrow.
Big question mark. Yeah.
We'll see.
Okay, well, we'll keep our eye on the Supreme Court. We should know, is the argument today? Is that what you're saying?
The argument's happening right now.
Okay, all right, well, we better go turn our attention to that instead. And you'll need to do so, I'm sure, for the front page, so we'll let you go. Thanks very much for stopping by. We'll check in again next Tuesday and see if anything makes any more sense.
Absolutely. Have a good week.
Thank you. Do the same. All right, time now to turn things over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy.
NetworksRadio.com. listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
All right, now I don't know if he's got battery backup, but I think that he'll be able to get his show out without any more problem. Let's see. After being called out by Trump at CPAC, Representative Kinzinger said that it is not a bad enemies list to be on. That's good. He's holding firm in the face of the withering criticism from grumpy old Trump.